On the morning of August 18th, 1979, a woman named Ruth Caldwell loaded a 1961 Farmall 560 onto a flatbed trailer by herself. No help, no fanfare, just Ruth, a rusted ramp, two wooden chocks, and a tractor that looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a river somewhere in the previous decade. The red paint had long since faded to something closer to the color of old brick dust. There was a dent above the left headlight where a falling elm branch had struck it in the spring of 1974. The exhaust stack was ringed with carbon black that no amount of wire brushing had ever fully removed. The rear fender on the right side bore a crack that Ruth had welded herself twice, and the weld showed rough and honest like a scar that never quite healed flat. She tied it down with 4 chains, checked each one, checked them again, and climbed into her truck. It was 6:40 in the morning. The August heat was already building. By afternoon, Fremont County would feel like the inside of a grain bin with the sun bearing down on the metal roof. Ruth knew that. She'd lived in Fremont County her entire life. She knew the way the heat came in August, the way the air tasted before a late summer storm, the way the soil in her north field turned from dark and workable to pale and cracked if you went 3 weeks without rain. She knew this land the way you know a face you've looked at every day for 44 years. Which is to say, she knew it better than she knew almost anything else. She drove the 22 miles to the fairgrounds in silence, with the windows down and the radio off. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about what he would have said if he'd known what today was going to become. Walt Caldwell had bought the Farmall 560 in the summer of 1967 from a John Deere dealer in Cedar Rapids, who had taken it in on trade and had no particular interest in keeping it. Walt paid $900 for it. He drove it home on the highway at 14 miles an hour with the hazard lights blinking, which was the kind of thing Walt Caldwell did without embarrassment, because Walt Caldwell had not spent a single moment of his 61 years on Earth worrying about what things looked like from the outside. He was that kind of man. He had come to Iowa as a boy when his own father brought the family east from a failed Nebraska homestead in 1919. They had arrived with 2 suitcases, a milk cow, and the specific kind of determination that comes from having already lost everything once and having survived it. Walt's grandfather had worked other men's land for 15 years before he could afford a single acre of his own. Walt's father had turned that acre into 40. Walt himself had taken 40 acres and made it 280. He hadn't done it fast. He hadn't done it with borrowed money. He had done it the way his father had taught him, slowly, carefully, with the kind of patience that most people mistake for stubbornness until they see the results. By the time Ruth was born in 1935, the Caldwell farm was a settled and serious operation. Not grand, not the kind of place anyone would drive past and feel envious of, but solid, paid for, real. Ruth had grown up between the barn and the fields, learning the rhythms of both the way children learn language, by immersion, by repetition, by the slow accumulation of 1,000 small moments that eventually become understanding. She knew which fields drained well and which held water. She knew how to read the sky before a frost. She knew the sound a tractor engine made when it was running clean versus when something was beginning to go wrong. She had learned most of that from Walt. She had learned the rest from Hank. Hank Caldwell. He'd taken her name when they married a thing that had raised a few eyebrows in Fremont County in 1957. But that Walt had quietly approved of because it meant the name on the deed stayed the same, was the kind of man Ruth had recognized immediately as someone she could build a life with. Not because he was spectacular, not because he swept her off her feet, but because when he looked at the land, he saw the same thing she saw. He understood what it meant to tend something over time. He understood patience in the same language Walt had taught Ruth to speak it. They had 20 good years. In the fall of 1976, on a cold October afternoon with the corn harvest half finished and the sky turning the flat gray of approaching winter, a bearing seized in the drive shaft of the combine, Hank was running on the east field. The machine lurched. Hank went to check. He shouldn't have gone to check while the header was still engaged. He knew better. He had been farming for 20 years and he knew better. And in the 3 seconds when he forgot that he knew better, everything changed. He was gone before the ambulance reached the farm. Ruth was 41 years old. She had no children. She had 280 acres, a full season's harvest, still standing in the field, a barn full of equipment, and a silence in the farmhouse that she didn't know what to do with. She finished the harvest herself. She hired one man for 2 weeks, a retired farmer from the next county named Gus, who worked without being asked and asked for nothing beyond what she paid him. She did the rest alone. Walt died the following year in the spring of 1977, quietly in his own bed at the age of 71, with the windows open and the smell of turned earth coming in from the fields outside. He left Ruth everything, which was only the farm, but the farm was enough. After the funeral, after the neighbors had come and gone, after the casseroles had been eaten and the sympathy cards had been stacked in a pile on the kitchen table and then put in a box and then put in a closet, Ruth sat in the kitchen alone and tried to understand what she was supposed to do next. She was 42 years old. She had lost a husband and a father in the same 18 months. She owned 280 acres of paid-for Iowa farmland and every piece of equipment on it in a farmhouse that felt in those first months about 3 times too large for one person. She decided to keep farming. There were people who told her she shouldn't. Not unkindly, but with the particular certainty that men of a certain generation apply to questions about what women should and shouldn't do with inherited land. Her father's banker suggested she might want to consider selling and investing the proceeds. A neighbor offered to buy the north field at what he called a fair price, which Ruth looked up and determined was 11% below market value. A man from the county extension office drove out to the farm in April to discuss her options, and when he left 2 hours later, he had not changed Ruth's thinking on any subject whatsoever. Roy Hargrove came twice. The first time was in the summer of 1977, 6 weeks after Walt's funeral. Roy drove up the long gravel drive in a truck that was newer than anything in Ruth's equipment shed and sat down at her kitchen table with a briefcase and a number written on a piece of paper. He was 50 years old, heavy in the shoulders, with the particular ease of a man who had never had to work hard to be taken seriously. He explained that the land adjoining his north parcel would round out his operation considerably and that he was prepared to offer a price that was, in his words, more than generous. Ruth looked at the number. She folded the paper in half and set it back on the table. "Not for sale," she said. Roy studied her for a moment. He had the look of a man consulting an internal inventory of persuasive approaches. "Ruth," he said, "you're farming alone. You've had a difficult couple of years. There's no shame in—" "Not for sale," she said again. He came back in the fall of 1978 with a higher number. Ruth didn't look at it. "My father built this farm," she said, and she said it in a tone that communicated without ambiguity that the conversation was finished. Roy left. He didn't seem angry. He seemed, if anything, more interested than before, the way a man gets when he decides that the obstacle in front of him is a problem to be solved rather than a limit to be respected. Ruth didn't think much about Roy Hargrove after that. She had a farm to run. There were things about Roy Hargrove that Fremont County understood perfectly, and there were things about him that the county had never fully examined because the county had never needed to. His grandfather had bought 800 acres during the Depression for prices that Ruth's father would have described, with the particular plainness of the Iowa vocabulary, as pennies on the dollar. The Hargrove family had arrived in Fremont County with money that predated the bust, and they had used that money to acquire land from families who didn't have the luxury of waiting out the crisis. It was legal. It was common enough in those years. It was the kind of transaction that people in agricultural communities understand without endorsing. By 1979, Roy had expanded the operation to 2,200 acres. He had done it the same way his grandfather had, with a checkbook, with timing, and with the specific willingness to show up at moments when other people were least able to say no. Every farm auction in the county, Roy was there. Every family that ran out of runway before the harvest could save them, Roy was waiting on the other side of that runway with an offer. He sat on the county board. He sat on the co-op board. He sat on the church finance committee. He drove a new truck every 2 years. He bought a John Deere 4440 in June of 1979, brand new, straight off the lot and walking, with a turbocharged diesel engine producing over 130 horsepower, a power shift transmission, factory air conditioning, and a sound-dampened cab. The sticker price was $47,000. Roy paid cash. He had won the Fremont County Fair tractor pull 3 years running, 1976, 1977, 1978, with his previous John Deere 4330, which had been dominant enough. The 4440 was a different animal entirely. Roy expected to win again in 1979 with a margin that would not be close. He expected this with the absolute calm of a man to whom winning had become indistinguishable from breathing. It wasn't arrogance exactly, or it wasn't only arrogance. It was something more like a settled worldview, a framework in which Roy Hargrove occupied a certain position relative to every other person and thing in Fremont County, and in which that position was confirmed regularly enough that questioning it had ceased to feel like a reasonable activity. What Roy had not anticipated on the morning of August 18, 1979, was seeing Ruth Caldwell's name on the competitor registration sheet. He stood at the entry table for a long moment, looking at the name. Betty Callahan, who had been running fair registration since 1964 and who had known Ruth since they were girls in the same grade school, watched him from behind the table with the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned to read Roy Hargrove's silences over many years. She registered, Roy said. She did, Betty said. With the 560, Betty didn't answer that. She didn't need to. Roy looked at the sheet for another moment. Then he took out his own registration form, filled it in, paid his entry fee, and walked toward the staging area with a particular expression on his face that Betty would describe later to several people as the look of a man who has just decided something. There was in the history of the Farmall 560 that sat in Ruth Caldwell's equipment barn a secret that had been kept for 8 years. Walt Caldwell had discovered it in the winter of 1971 when a cracked head gasket forced him to pull the engine apart. He had done this kind of work himself his entire life. He knew what an engine was supposed to look like. And what he found when he got the head off was not what a standard Farmall 560 was supposed to look like. The cylinders had been bored out. The pistons were heavier than stock with a compression ratio that didn't match any specification Walt could find in his manuals. The camshaft had a profile he didn't recognize. The tolerances throughout the bottom end were machined to a precision that exceeded anything the factory would have applied to a production unit. Walt was a methodical man. He documented what he found. He spent 3 months making calls, writing letters to dealers, reaching out through the network of old agricultural contacts that a man builds up over 50 years of farming. He finally reissued a retired engineer from International Harvester named Doyle, who had worked in the development division in the early 1960s. Doyle listened to Walt's description. Then Doyle got very quiet on the phone. He asked Walt for the serial number. Walt gave it to him. Doyle was quiet again for almost a full minute. What Walt had purchased from that dealer in Cedar Rapids was not a standard Farmall 560. It was one of a small batch of modified units that International Harvester's engineering department had built in 1962 to serve as development platforms for what would become the Farm, all 706, a larger, more powerful model intended to replace the 560 series. The engineering team had bored out cylinders, upgraded pistons, fitted prototype camshafts, and run these machines under extended load conditions to test component durability and power output at elevated specifications. When the testing was complete, the units were supposed to be scrapped. Most of them were. One of them had somehow ended up in the used inventory of a Cedar Rapids dealership, stripped of its test designation, cataloged as a standard 560, and sold to Walt Caldwell for $900 in the summer of 1967. The actual power output of Ruth's tractor was not the 60 horsepower printed in any manual. Based on the modifications, Doyle estimated the engine was producing somewhere between 85 and 90 horsepower, possibly more depending on wear and current condition. Walt thanked Doyle. He finished the head gasket repair. He put the engine back together. He called Earl Sims. Earl had spent 31 years working for International Harvester, first as a line mechanic in Decatur, later as a field service technician across eastern Iowa. He had retired in 1969 and now ran a one-man repair shop out of a tin-sided building on his property outside of Shenandoah, where he fixed anything with an engine and charged prices that had not meaningfully changed since 1971. He was 68 years old, thin as fence wire, with hands that told the complete story of 31 years of mechanical labor. Walt explained what he had found. Earl drove out to the farm, spent an afternoon with the engine, and confirmed everything Doyle had said. "Don't let them know," Walt told him. "It doesn't matter. The tractor does what I need it to do." Earl nodded. He understood. In the world Walt Caldwell occupied, the world of careful men who owned their land and minded their own affairs and had no need to advertise their advantages, The right response to a secret was to keep it. Walt kept it for 4 years until he died in the spring of 1977. His last conversation with Earl, 3 days before the end in the bedroom with the windows open and the smell of the fields coming in, had included one instruction about the tractor. Don't let them take the machine, Earl. It's worth more than they think. Earl had kept that instruction for 2 years. He had gone to the farm after the funeral and waited for the right time to tell Ruth. But Ruth in those first months was not interested in talking about the farm. She was not interested in talking about equipment. She was not Earl sensed with the perceptiveness of a man who has spent a lifetime listening to machinery and has learned to hear what isn't being said. She was not interested in talking about anything that connected her too directly to the two men she had just lost. Earl waited. He was good at waiting. On the morning of August 18, 1979, Earl Sims pulled his truck into the Fremont County Fairgrounds at 7:15 and found Ruth Caldwell sitting on the rear bumper of her flatbed drinking coffee from a thermos and watching the fairground crew set up the pull track. She looked up when she heard his truck. She didn't seem surprised to see him. Earl had that quality, the quality of arriving at the exact moment he was needed, and in such a way that his presence seemed inevitable rather than coincidental. He sat down beside her on the bumper without being invited, which was the kind of thing a man can do only after a certain number of years of earned trust. Your father told me something before he died, Earl said, about the tractor. Ruth looked at the tractor on the trailer. She had the expression of a woman who was about to be told something she had unconsciously suspected for some time. Earl told her everything: the bored cylinders, the prototype pistons, the camshaft profile, what the retired IH engineer had said about the test mule program, what Walt had told him the week before he died. Ruth sat with this information for a long moment. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the tractor. How much more power, she said. 85-90 horses. Earl paused. Maybe a touch more if the modifications held up well. He's been maintaining it right. You've been maintaining it right against a 4440. Earl was quiet. She turned and looked at him. Did you know Roy entered today? I saw the sheet, Earl said. She looked back at the tractor. He's been after the North Field for 2 years. I know that too. Ruth finished her coffee. She screwed the cap back onto the thermos with the deliberate, unhurried movements of a woman who makes decisions only after she's finished thinking. Why didn't my father tell me, she said. It wasn't quite a question. It was more like things she needed to say aloud. Earl thought about it for a moment. Because it didn't change anything for him, he said finally. The tractor did what he needed it to do. He didn't need anyone to know. Ruth nodded slowly. She stood up, set the thermos on the bumper, and began unloading chains from the flatbed. The competitor staging area was arranged along the south fence of the pull track, a line of machines that together constituted a summary of the current state of American agricultural technology. 2 case tractors with recently rebuilt engines. An International 1466 that its owner had been campaigning in regional pulls for 3 years. A Massey Ferguson that had been modified with competition-grade ballast, and a fuel system that its owner declined to discuss in specific terms. And Ruth Caldwell's 1961 Farmall 560, which was the oldest machine in the lineup by a full decade, and which drew the kind of attention that very ugly things draw when they appear among beautiful ones, not admiration, but fascination. The involuntary double take. The second look that wants to confirm what the first look reported. Roy Hargrove walked through the staging area at 9:30 with his thumbs in his belt loops and the particular gait of a man conducting an informal inspection of his domain. He stopped in front of the Farmall. He walked around it slowly, the way he always walked around it, the way Ruth had watched him walk around it both times he came to the farm, looking for a weakness that confirmed what he already believed. He kicked one of the rear tires. The tire was solid and properly inflated because Ruth Caldwell kept her equipment in working order, regardless of what it looked like on the outside, but Roy didn't know that, and the kick was not really about the tire. Ruth was standing at the back of the tractor, checking the hitch assembly. She didn't look up. Roy stopped about 6 feet away. You know what I'll give you for that machine, he said. Right now today. $200, and I won't even haul it. I'll send someone for it. Ruth checked the hitch pin. She checked the locking clip. Then she looked up. Her face, people would say later, was impossible to read. Not cold exactly, not angry, just very still. The way a field looks before a storm, not threatening, but full of something. It's not for sale, she said. Roy smiled. He had a good smile. He had spent 52 years deploying it. Ruth, he said, I've got 130 horsepower under that hood over there. Factory turbocharged. That machine of yours is running on 60 horses if it's lucky, and they're 18-year-old horses at that. You're going to embarrass yourself out here today. Ruth went back to the hitch. We'll see, she said. And then without changing her tone or her expression or the pace of what she was doing, she said one more thing. Tell me something, Roy. How much did your grandfather pay Walt Perkins for that quarter section on the east side when Perkins went under in 33? Roy's smile didn't disappear, but something shifted behind it. That was a long time ago, he said. It was. Ruth agreed. Things were different then. She went back to work. Roy stood there for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward his John Deere. Frank Dolan, who had been watching this exchange from 20 feet away with the studied attention of a man who understands that he is witnessing something that will be told and retold for years, picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip and said nothing to anyone. The open class registration drew 15 competitors. The pull began at 2 in the afternoon after the lighter divisions had run and the grandstands had filled to capacity with the particular crowd that a county fair tractor pull generates in August in Iowa. Farmers and their families, retired men with programs folded in their back pockets, children who had been promised funnel cake. If they sat still into a scattering of serious pull enthusiasts who had driven from 2 counties over and who could distinguish between a modified fuel system and a well-tuned stock engine by the sound of the exhaust. Betty Callahan, working the competitor check-in table, had mentioned to exactly 3 people that Ruth Caldwell had entered with the old Farmall. By the time the open class began, there was not a person in the grandstand who didn't know. The format was standard. Each tractor pulled a weighted sled down a 300-foot track. The sled used a progressive weight transfer mechanism. As the sled moved forward, the effective load increased, making each successive foot harder to pull than the last. Whoever pulled the sled the farthest advanced. A full pull 300 feet with the sled still moving put you in the finals with added weight. Ruth drew 8th position. Roy drew 12th. The first 7 tractors pulled distances ranging from 191 feet to a full pull. The International Mall 1466 went the distance. So did one of the case machines. The crowd was warm and engaged the way county fair crowds get when the weather is right and the competition is honest. Then it was Ruth's turn. She climbed onto the Farmall without hurry. She settled into the seat the way a person settles into a chair they have sat in 10,000 times. She checked the throttle position. She checked the gear. She started the engine. The Farmall caught on the first compression stroke. Not the second, the first. And the sound it made was not the sound anyone in the staging area had expected. It was deep and authoritative, a sound too large somehow for the machine it was coming from, like a voice coming out of a body that looks too small to produce it. Several people in the grandstand turned toward the sound before the tractor had even moved. Earl Sims was standing at the fence line with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, and an expression that was not quite a smile. Not quite. Ruth let the engine warm for 45 seconds. Then she pulled forward to the sled and hooked on. The track judge gave her the signal. Ruth eased the clutch out with the smooth, habitual precision of a woman who has been engaging clutches since 1962. The Farmall moved forward. At 100 feet, it looked like a respectable pull. The engine was working, the tractor was moving, the crowd was watching with polite interest. At 150 feet, the polite interest changed. At 200 feet, people were straightening in their seats. At 250 feet, a section of the grandstand was on its feet. The Farmall's engine was not screaming in distress. It was working. There is a difference, and experienced ears could hear it. This was not a machine being pushed past its limits. This was a machine operating within its limits. Limits that were simply much wider than anyone in that grandstand had calculated. The exhaust stack threw black smoke against the blue August sky. The rear tires dug into the dirt and threw rooster tails of soil that arced out behind the tractor in 2 dark parabolas. Ruth sat upright and still in the seat, her hands on the wheel, her eyes on the track ahead. At 275 feet, the crowd was making a sound that was not quite cheering yet. It was the sound of 2,000 people recalculating something simultaneously. At 290 feet, they found out what cheering sounded like. The Farmall crossed the 300-foot line with the sled still moving behind it. Full pull. The grandstand erupted. Not the polite eruption that greets a good performance from a favorite. The louder, more disoriented eruption that greets something no one was prepared for. People were grabbing each other's arms. People were pointing. People were looking at their neighbors with the specific expression of a person who wants confirmation that they saw what they think they saw. Ruth drove back to the staging area at the same pace she had left it. She shut the engine off. She climbed down. She walked to the water cooler at the end of the fence line and filled a paper cup and drank it standing up. She did not look at the grandstand. She did not look at Roy Hargrove. But Roy Hargrove looked at her. He was standing 40 feet away next to his $47,000 John Deere with its climate-controlled cab and its factory turbocharger and its power shift transmission. And for the first time in a very long time, perhaps for the first time anyone at the Fremont County Fair could remember, Roy Hargrove was not smiling. He was doing the thing that proud men do when reality first begins to separate from expectation. He was standing very still and very straight and looking at something that didn't fit the story he had been telling himself and trying to decide whether the story needed a revision or whether the something was simply wrong. Earl Sims at the fence line unfolded his arms and reached into his shirt pocket for a toothpick. He put it in the corner of his mouth and looked out at the track with the calm satisfaction of a man who has been waiting 8 years for a piece of information to find its proper moment. Walt Caldwell Earl thought would have found this very satisfying. He thought Walt probably would have said something plain and modest about it afterward, something like "the tractor runs fine," which was the kind of thing Walt said, meaning a great deal more than it sounded like. In the staging area, Ruth refilled her paper cup. She looked at the sky. The August heat was full and flat and honest, the way Iowa heat gets in the middle of the afternoon, pressing down on everything equally without preference or mercy. Roy Hargrove had 4 pulls between now and his own, 4 chances to watch the scoreboard and understand what he was up against. Ruth folded her paper cup and put it in the trash barrel and walked back to her tractor. She had a finals to prepare for. The finals were set for 5:30. That gave Roy Hargrove 3 hours. 3 hours to sit with what he had watched, to recalibrate, to find within his considerable inventory of self-assurance some explanation that returned the world to its proper order. A mechanical anomaly, perhaps. A favorable draw position. Loose soil in the track where Ruth had run that gave the tires better purchase than the compacted line he would be pulling on. There was always an explanation. Roy had spent 52 years locating explanations that preserved the essential architecture of his understanding. He found 4 tractors between Ruth's pull and his own, and he watched each one with the focused attention of a man who was really watching something else entirely. The second case machine pulled 263 feet. The Massey Ferguson reached 251 before the rear tires broke loose and spun. A modified Oliver from over the county line, a machine its owner had been quietly campaigning for 2 seasons, with results that had attracted attention from the serious pull community, went 278 feet and stopped there. Engine straining, tires, smoking the sled, refusing to give another inch. Roy noted that distance with the careful neutrality of a man who is not going to allow himself to feel anything about it until he has more information. He climbed into his John Deere at 5:28. The cab was cool. The air conditioning was set to 68 degrees, which Roy had always maintained was the optimal temperature for sustained concentration. The leather seat adjusted hydraulically to his exact specifications. The instrument panel glowed with the calm authority of modern engineering. Roy rested his hands on the wheel and felt for a moment the particular comfort of being surrounded by everything you have paid for. He pulled to the line at 5:31. The crowd was quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when they understand that what they are about to watch matters. Not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for a favorite to perform. A different quiet. The kind that gathers when people are genuinely uncertain about what they are about to see. The flag dropped. Roy hit the throttle with the clean confidence of a man who has done this before and done it well and sees no compelling reason why today should be different. The John Deere moved forward with the smooth, powerful authority that 130 turbocharged horsepower produces when it is properly applied. The crowd began to murmur. At 100 feet, the murmur became something warmer. At 150 feet, people were nodding. This was what a serious machine looked like. This was the sound of real power moving a real load. At 200 feet, Roy was exactly where he needed to be. At 240 feet, the sled's weight transfer mechanism reached the range where the load becomes genuinely punishing, where the difference between available power and required power begins to close, and where a driver has to manage throttle and traction simultaneously with a precision that no amount of engineering can entirely automate. At 260 feet, Roy felt the rear tires begin to lose their authority on the track surface. He adjusted. He had done this before. He shifted his weight, modulated the throttle, applied the specific corrections that had won him 3 county championships. For 5 seconds, the tractor held. At 278 feet, the rear tires broke free completely. They spun in place, throwing dirt, making the sound of power being wasted, the particular hollow roar of an engine working against nothing because the connection between power and ground has been severed. Roy made 3 more attempts to find traction. Each one lasted about a second and a half and produced nothing but more noise and more dirt. The sled had stopped. 278 feet, 9 feet short of Ruth Caldwell's mark. For a moment, the grandstand was so quiet that you could hear the John Deere's engine idling. Then the sound began, not the eruption that had greeted Ruth's pull, but something slower and more complex. The sound of 2,000 people processing the gap between what they had assumed and what had just happened. Murmuring that grew. Conversations that started and stopped. Somewhere in the upper section of the grandstand, a man laughed, not cruelly, just the involuntary laugh of genuine surprise, and that laugh opened a space that other sounds rushed into. Roy sat in the cab for a long moment. He was looking straight ahead at the end of the track. His hands were still on the wheel. The air conditioning was still set to 68 degrees. The 2 remaining tractors pulled after him. Both fell short of 275 feet. Neither came close to Ruth's mark. When the announcer read the final results, his voice carried the careful, studied neutrality of a man who understands he is delivering news that will be discussed in this county for a very long time. First place open class, Ruth Caldwell, 1961 Farmall 5.60, distance 287 feet. The grandstand made a sound that had nothing careful or neutral about it. Roy climbed down from the John Deere with the measured deliberateness of a man who is managing what his body wants to do. His face was composed. His jaw was set. He walked toward the edge of the staging area with his hands in his pockets and found a position near the fence where he could observe the proceedings without being the center of them. He had been in this county for 52 years. He had never not been the center of them. Ruth collected her trophy and her $500 prize check from the announcer's table without ceremony. She shook the announcer's hand. She said something that made him smile, though no one close enough to hear it later remembered what it was. She put the check in the front pocket of her work shirt and the trophy under her arm and walked back through the crowd toward the staging area. She stopped about 8 feet from Roy. She reached into the breast pocket of her shirt, other one, the one that didn't have the prize check, and produced a folded piece of paper. She held it out. $10,000, she said. You made the bet loud enough for half this county to hear it. I'd like what you owe me. There were at least 40 people in immediate proximity. There were more behind them. Word had traveled through the fairground the way word travels in small counties fast and with the particular accuracy that comes from people who have known each other long enough to understand the specific weight of what they are witnessing. Roy looked at the paper. He looked at Ruth. His jaw worked once without producing a sound. The internal inventory of explanations that Roy Hargrove maintained across a lifetime was being birched rapidly for anything that could be deployed in this specific moment. There was nothing to find. The bet had been made publicly, loudly, and with the theatrical confidence of a man who considered the outcome predetermined. There were witnesses whose names he knew, whose children he had watched grow up, whose opinion of him had been until approximately 45 minutes ago reliably favorable. Roy reached into his jacket. He took out his checkbook. He wrote the check with the careful, legible penmanship of a man who has signed a great many documents and understands that what you write down is what you stand behind. He held it out without looking at her. Ruth took it. She looked at it once, folded it, and put it in her pocket with the prize check and the rest of the afternoon's accounting. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked back to her flatbed, where Earl Sims was already beginning to guide the Farmall up the loading ramp with the patient efficiency of a man who has been quietly waiting for the right moment to do the next useful thing. Frank Dolan was standing near the gate. He had been standing near the gate for the last 20 minutes watching. He watched Ruth load the tractor. He watched Roy walk to his truck. He stood there after both of them had gone, holding his empty coffee cup, turning it slowly in his hands, and thinking that he had just seen something he would still be thinking about when he was old. Roy Hargrove did not take the loss well. This was not in itself surprising. What was surprising, what would take the county several years to fully understand, was the specific form that Roy's response to the loss took. A smaller man, or perhaps a wiser one, might have absorbed the defeat and let it reduce him slightly, the way a significant setback reduces most people, takes a layer off the surface. Confidence introduces a modicum of caution, creates the conditions for a different kind of thinking. Roy did not do this. Roy did the other thing. 6 weeks after the Fremont County Fair, in the first week of October 1979, Roy Hargrove made an offer on 400 additional acres of farmland in the northern part of the county. The asking price was $2,600 per acre. Roy paid it without negotiating. He financed the entire purchase through the bank in Shenandoah, $800,000 in new debt on top of the existing obligations he carried from previous expansions and equipment purchases. When people asked him about it, Roy said it was a sound investment. Land prices had been climbing steadily for 15 years. There was no reason to believe they would stop. The fundamentals of agricultural economics in Northeast Iowa were solid. He said this with the specific confidence of a man who has decided to answer a question about pride with a vocabulary of finance. Frank Dolan heard Roy explain this at the co-op in November and said nothing. He was farming 320 acres with a 10-year-old Oliver and a loan payment coming due in December that he was not certain he could make. He understood debt in the personal, concrete way that men understand things that keep them awake at night. He looked at Roy and thought with the particular clarity that comes from standing close to your own financial edge, that what Roy was describing was not an investment, it was a response. But Frank didn't say this. Men in Fremont County in 1979 did not as a rule say things like that to Roy Hargrove. Ruth deposited the $10,000 check on the Monday morning after the fair. She stood at the teller's window in the Shenandoah Bank and endorsed the check and slid it across the marble counter and asked for it to go into her savings account. The teller, a young woman named Cora who had started working there in June, looked at the amount and then at Ruth with the involuntary attention that a significant number draws from anyone whose job involves handling money. Ruth did not explain the check. She took her deposit receipt, folded it into her wallet, and drove home. The money sat in the savings account untouched. This was not a decision Ruth made consciously, not at first. She simply did not spend it. There was always something else the farm needed, always some more immediate demand on the operating account, always a reason to leave that particular balance where it was. But as the months passed and the balance stayed at $10,000, with its small accumulation of interest, Ruth began to understand that she was not leaving it there because she forgot about it. She was leaving it there because spending it felt wrong in a way she could not entirely articulate. It didn't feel like winnings. It felt like something that had been said, like the money was a sentence that Roy had constructed in public and she had simply received it, and now it sat in her account the way an unanswered statement sits in a room. She mentioned this once in the spring of 1980 to Earl Sims. He had come to the farm to help her with a carburetor issue on the Farmall, and they were sitting on the tailgate of her truck eating the sandwiches Ruth had made, and she said out of something adjacent to nowhere that she had not spent the $10,000 and was not sure she was going to. Earl thought about this while he finished his sandwich. Your father was the same way about certain things, he said finally. Some money doesn't feel like yours to use. Ruth looked at the barn. He used to say debts run in both directions, she said. Earl nodded. He ate the last corner of his sandwich. That sounds like Walt, he said. The storm, when it came from everywhere at once. In 1980, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to combat inflation that had been building through the late 1970s like pressure in a sealed system. The prime rate climbed into the high teens. By 1981, it would peak at over 20%. For farmers who had borrowed at variable rates, who had taken on debt against land values that had been climbing for a decade, and that seemed from the perspective of 1978 or 1979 as though they would simply continue to climb, the arithmetic changed overnight. Land values that had supported the debt began to fall. Farm income that had been projected against commodity prices that declined sharply began to miss projections. Loans that had been serviceable became burdensome. Loans that had been burdensome became impossible. The farm crisis of the early 1980s did not arrive dramatically. It arrived the way a field floods in a heavy rain slowly, at first water, finding its level filling the low spots, and then suddenly inexplicably all at once. Foreclosure notices, auctions, families that had worked the same land for 3 generations loading trucks and leaving. The specific quality of silence that settles over a farmhouse after it has been emptied. Roy Hargrove had borrowed heavily before the storm. He had borrowed in 1979 for the 400 additional acres. He had borrowed in previous years for equipment, for buildings, for operating expenses during the leaner seasons. By 1982, the total picture of his debt was something that his banker, a careful man named Aldrich, who had been at the Shenandoah Bank for 22 years, looked at with the expression of a man who wishes he were looking at something else. Roy's collateral, the land, the equipment, the buildings had been worth approximately $1.4 million at the peak of the market. By 1983, it was worth considerably less. By 1984, the gap between what Roy owed and what his assets could cover had become a specific and documented problem that Aldrich discussed with Roy in quarterly meetings with increasing directness and declining results. Roy did not want to hear what Aldrich was telling him. He had spent 52 years as the largest, most solvent, most creditworthy farmer in Fremont County, and the idea that this status was conditional rather than permanent was one that his architecture of self-understanding was not built to accommodate. He sold some equipment. He restructured where he could. He let 2 of his hired men go in the spring of 1984 and did more of the work himself, which he had not done at that level in 20 years. Loretta watched all of this with the particular attention of a woman who has built a life alongside a man and can read the difference between a difficult season and a structural collapse. Thomas came home from his second year of an agricultural program at Iowa State in the spring of 1984 and did not go back in the fall. By January of 1985, the bank had filed the paperwork. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for March 15th. Aldrich called Roy at home to tell him, and Roy sat at the kitchen table after the call was over for 40 minutes without moving, with the phone still in his hand, while Loretta stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched him and understood that the thing she had been afraid was coming had arrived. Ruth heard about the auction from Betty Callahan, who heard it from the bank clerk, who was Cora, who had taken Ruth's deposit of $10,000 in the fall of 1979, and who remembered the amount with the specific memory that significant numbers leave in the minds of people who handle money for a living. Ruth heard it on a Tuesday. She sat with it for 2 days. She thought about her father. She thought about the conversation she and Earl had sitting on the tailgate of her truck in the spring of 1980. She thought about a thing Walt had told her once when she was 12 years old, and a neighboring family had lost their farm in a bad year, and Ruth had asked him whether that was fair. "The land doesn't care who's fair," Walt had said. "The land just needs someone to tend it right. Our job is to make sure it gets tended right." She thought about Roy Hargrove at the registration table the morning of the fair. She thought about the way he had kicked the tire of the Farmall and offered her $200 for it. She thought about the 2 visits to her kitchen, the 2 numbers on the 2 pieces of paper, the smile that never quite reached his eyes. She thought about her father working for Roy's father in the years before the war. Walt had worked those fields for 4 years, 1938 to 1942, before he had saved enough to make the first payment on 40 acres of his own. Roy's father, Gerald Hargrove, had paid him a fair wage. Not a generous wage, a fair one. At a time when fair was not guaranteed and was worth something. Walt had not forgotten it. Walt did not forget things that mattered. Ruth thought about all of this for 2 days, and on the 3rd day, she got in her truck and drove to the Hargrove farm. The gravel drive was the same drive Roy had come up twice to sit at her kitchen table with his briefcase and his numbers. It was longer than her drive, and the buildings at the end of it were larger, and the whole operation had the scale of something that had been built over generations to project permanence and weight. Now, in the gray of a February afternoon, with the fields bare and the sky flat and the machinery in the yard not quite right, not quite arranged with the purposeful readiness of a working farm, but slightly disordered, slightly too still, it had a different quality. Loretta Hargrove answered the door. Her eyes were red at the rims in the way that eyes get when they have been red for a long time and have simply settled into it. She looked at Ruth with an expression that moved through surprise and something close to shame before arriving at a complicated and quiet dignity. "Ruth," she said. Loretta Ruth said, "I'd like to speak with Roy if he'll see me." Loretta stepped back without saying anything further. Roy was in the living room. He was sitting in a chair by the window that looked out over the north field, the field he had bought from Walt Perkins in 1962, the field that had started the long accumulation that had become 2,200 acres and was now becoming something less. He had not shaved in several days. He was wearing work clothes that he had clearly slept in. He looked in the flat afternoon light like a man who had been sitting in that chair for a long time and had lost track of his reasons for getting up. When he saw Ruth in the doorway, something crossed his face. It came and went quickly, but it was there. Shame, perhaps, or the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just been seen carrying it. "Come to watch me fall," he said. His voice was flat, not aggressive, just flat in the way that voices go when the energy required for aggression has been spent on something else. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she walked into the room, moved a stack of papers from the chair across from him, sat down, took off her work cap, and held it in her hands. "I have a proposition," she said. Roy looked at her for a long moment. The word proposition sat in the room between them like something that had been set down carefully and was waiting to be picked up. Ruth held her cap in both hands and kept her eyes on him with the patient steadiness of a woman who has sat through difficult silences before and understands that rushing them produces nothing useful. Roy's gaze moved from her face to the window. Outside, the north field stretched flat and gray under the February sky, the soil turned and bare, waiting for a spring that Roy Hargrove was no longer certain he would be here to plant into. "Talk," he said. Ruth set her cap on her knee. "I'll pay off what you owe the bank," she said. "All of it. $380,000. I spoke with Aldrich on Monday. He confirmed the number." Roy's eyes came back to her. Something shifted in them, not hope, not yet, but the precursor to hope, the involuntary attention that a drowning man gives to anything that might be solid. In exchange, Ruth continued, "You deed me 600 acres, the original Hargrove land. The parcels your grandfather acquired in the 30s. Roy was very still. "That's half the farm," he said. "I know what it is. That land has been in my family since I know how long it's been in your family," Ruth said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply precise the way Walt Caldwell's voice had been precise when he was communicating something that he needed the other person to understand without embellishment. "You keep 1,600 acres. You keep the house, the outbuildings, the machinery. You keep enough to farm if you farm it right. The bank gets paid. The auction doesn't happen. Thomas doesn't lose his home." Roy looked at the window again. "Why," he said. The word came out stripped of everything except the question itself. No challenge in it, no suspicion, just the genuine and bewildered need to understand why a woman he had tried to buy out twice, a woman he had publicly bet against and publicly lost, to a woman he had underestimated in every way a man can underestimate another person. Why that woman was sitting in his living room with $380,000 in an offer that was by any reasonable measure more than he deserved. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the cap in her hands. She turned it once the way she turned the thermos cap that morning at the fairground, deliberate and unhurried. "My father worked your father's land," she said, 1938 to 1942. 4 years. Your father paid him fair wages when he didn't have to, when most men in this county were paying whatever they could get away with paying because the men who needed work had no leverage to ask for more. Your father paid fair. Walt Caldwell remembered that for the rest of his life. Roy said nothing. "I'm not doing this for you," Ruth continued. "I want to be honest with you about that. I'm doing it because my father taught me that debts run in both directions. And because that land," she nodded toward the window, toward the fields beyond it, "that land has been tended for 50 years by people who understood what it was. I don't want to watch it get split up and sold off in parcels to people who will run it for 3 years and move on." She looked at him directly. "And because your boy didn't make the mistakes you made, Thomas shouldn't pay for what you did." Roy's jaw tightened, not in anger, in the specific way that a man's jaw tightens when he is trying to hold something in that wants to come out. He looked at his hands for a long moment. They were large hands, farmers' hands, the same hands that had written a $10,000 check in front of 2,000 people at the Fremont County Fair on a hot August afternoon 5.5 years ago. They looked older now than they had looked then. "You'd have until tomorrow morning," Ruth said. "After that, I'll buy at the auction, and I won't be leaving you anything." She stood. She put her cap back on. She walked to the door and stopped there for a moment with her hand on the frame, looking out at the hallway at the photographs on the wall. 3 generations of Hargroves in frames that had hung in the same positions for decades. She left without waiting for his answer. Roy called her at 6:45 the following morning. He said yes in a voice that had been reduced to its essential components, 2 letters, 1 syllable, and the complete absence of anything that was not necessary. Ruth said she would contact Aldrich. She called Aldrich at 8. The paperwork was drafted by the end of the week. Roy and Loretta signed the deed transfer on a Thursday afternoon at the bank in Shenandoah, with Aldrich and his assistant as witnesses. Roy signed his name with the same careful penmanship he had used to write the check at the fair. His hand did not shake. Ruth wrote the bank a check for $380,000 from the savings account she had been building since 1967, the account that held, among everything else, $10,000 that had been sitting untouched since October of 1979. She did not look at the balance after the check cleared. There was no point in looking at it. The money had been tended carefully for a long time, and now it had done what it needed to do, and that was the end of its story. Roy Hargrove did not become a different man overnight. He became a different man slowly in the way that land changes, not in sudden transformations, but in the patient, incremental accumulation of small alterations that eventually add up to something you can see. In the spring of 1985, he planted his first crop on 1,600 acres with 2 hired men instead of 4, and he did more of the field work himself than he had done in 15 years. It was harder than he remembered. His back reminded him daily that he was 58 years old. He did not complain about this to anyone. In the fall of 1986, his combine developed a hydraulic issue that a dealership in Waukon quoted him $1,100 to repair. Roy looked at the quote for a long time. Then he drove to Earl Sims's shop outside Shenandoah and asked Earl if he had time to look at it. Earl had time. The repair cost Roy $240 in parts and the better part of a Saturday. He spent most of that Saturday watching Earl work and asking questions, which was a thing Roy Hargrove had never done before, in the presence of a man he considered his social inferior. Earl answered the questions without comment on the fact that they were being asked. Roy came back the following spring with a different problem, and the spring after that with another one. By 1989, Roy Hargrove was doing most of his own mechanical work. His equipment was older than it had been in 1979 and considerably less impressive to look at, and it ran better than it had in years. In 1987, Roy sold the John Deere 4440. He bought a used International 986 that was 9 years old and had been properly maintained by its previous owner, a retired farmer near Clarinda, who had kept meticulous service records. Roy paid $9,000 for it. He drove it home on the highway at 16 miles an hour. He did not turn the radio on during the drive. He thought about Walt Caldwell, whom he had met once in 1942, when Walt came to say goodbye to Roy's father before leaving to look for land of his own. Roy had been 15. He remembered Walt as a quiet man with a direct handshake and the particular quality of self-possession that belongs to people who know exactly what they are and have made their peace with it. Roy had not thought about Walt Caldwell in 40 years. He thought about him a great deal after that drive home. Ruth and Roy did not become friends. Friendship requires a kind of ease that cannot be constructed from the materials available to 2 people who have stood on opposite sides of the kind of morning they had shared in Roy's living room in February of 1985. There was too much history, too much weight on too many of the words they might have used with each other, but they became something. At planting and harvest, when the county's farmers settled into the mutual reliance that agricultural life imposes on neighbors whether they choose it or not, Ruth and Roy helped each other in the practical, wordless way of people who understand that the work is larger than any grievance. Ruth's tractor crew helped Roy finish his north field in a wet October when his own equipment bogged down. Roy's grain bins held Ruth's corn for 2 weeks in a November when her dryer broke and the repair parts were back-ordered from Des Moines. They did not discuss these arrangements in advance. They were simply arrangements, the kind that form between neighbors who have arrived without quite deciding to, at a working respect. At the feed store in Shenandoah, when they encountered each other in the same aisle, they nodded. The nod communicated something that neither of them would have been able to fully articulate, but that both of them understood. It was not warmth exactly. It was acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of two people who have seen each other clearly, not as they presented themselves, but as they actually were, and have continued in the full knowledge of that seeing to coexist. Frank Dolan observed this over the years with the careful attention of a man who had been present at the beginning of something and wanted to understand where it ended up. He had recovered from his own debt difficulties in 1985 through a combination of hard work, banks' willingness to restructure, and a commodity price recovery that arrived just in time. He farmed his 320 acres carefully and without drama, and watched his neighbors with the quiet interest of a man who has learned that the most instructive things are usually happening just at the edge of what people choose to talk about. Frank told the story of the 1979 tractor pull and everything that followed it many times over the years at dinner tables at the co-op, at the diner in Shenandoah, on winter mornings when the farmers gathered over coffee because the fields were frozen and there was time to talk. He told it without embellishment, which was the reason people believed it. He told it the way Walt Caldwell would have told a story, plainly in the right order, leaving in the parts that mattered and leaving out the parts that didn't. He told it to his son, and his son told it to his children. And somewhere in that transmission, the story became the kind of story that a county holds on to, not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because it contains something true about the place and the people and the particular way that consequence moves through a life. In the summer of 1994, 15 years after the pull that changed everything, Ruth was driving the county road past the Hargrove farm on her way to Shenandoah when she saw Roy's tractor stopped in the middle of the north field. Not parked, stopped. There is a difference that anyone who has spent a life around farm equipment understands instantly, the difference between a machine that has been intentionally halted and a machine that has simply ceased. She pulled over. She got out. She walked to the fence line and looked across the field and saw Roy on the ground beside the tractor on his side with one hand pressed flat against the soil. She was over the fence before she had consciously decided to climb it. She reached him in less than a minute. He was conscious, his eyes open, his breathing shallow and strange. His face had a color that she recognized with the sick immediacy of someone who has seen it before, not on Roy, but on Hank in the last seconds before the ambulance arrived, and the ambulance was already too late. She had her hand on Roy's shoulder, and her voice was steady in the way that voices go steady when steadiness is what the moment requires, and there is no time for anything else. "I'm here," she said. "Stay with me." She had driven to Shenandoah 100 times for 100 ordinary reasons. She knew every mile of that road. She gave the dispatcher the field location with the precise specificity of a woman who understands that the difference between a useful description and a vague one is the difference between the ambulance finding you and the ambulance driving past. She stayed on the ground beside Roy while they waited. She did not hold his hand. She kept her hand on his shoulder, which felt right in a way that was different from holding his hand present, but not presumptuous. She talked to him in a steady, even voice about ordinary things: the weather, the condition of the fields, the fact that Earl Sims had told her last week that the Farmall was running as well as it ever had. She talked the way you talk to a person when you want them to stay in the world, not saying anything important, just filling the air with the sound of a voice that intends for them to still be there to hear the next sentence. Roy looked at her once directly with the specific quality of attention that people sometimes have in extreme moments, stripped of everything performed, everything constructed, entirely present. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. The paramedics were efficient and calm. They loaded Roy onto a stretcher, and Ruth stood back and watched, and then stood in the field alone for a moment after the ambulance left in the silence that it left behind. She looked at Roy's tractor. She looked at the soil under her boots. She thought about her father, who had worked soil like this for 40 years before the same soil received him. Then she walked back to her truck and drove to the hospital. Roy survived. The cardiologist in Shenandoah was direct with him in the way that cardiologists learn to be direct, because directness is what the situation requires, and the situation does not benefit from softening. Roy's heart had been under significant strain for years. The event in the North Field had been serious. The prognosis going forward was conditional on Roy doing considerably less of certain things, including farming. Roy listened to this. He asked 2 questions. He thanked the doctor. He lay in the hospital bed for 4 days and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who is recalculating something fundamental. Loretta sat with him every day. Thomas came from Omaha, where he had been working for an agricultural supply company, and stayed for a week. On the third day, Roy told Thomas that he was sorry for the years between 1979 and 1985, which Thomas received with the specific grace of a son who has carried something for a long time and is relieved to set it down. Roy came home on a Thursday. He walked through the house, slowly touching things as he passed them: the kitchen table, the door frame of the living room, the windowsill that looked out over the North Field. He stood at that window for a long time. A month after the hospital, he drove to Ruth Caldwell's farm. She was in the equipment barn when he pulled up, doing something to a hydraulic line on the Farmall, with the focused attention of a woman whose relationship with her machinery is ongoing and detailed. She looked up when she heard his truck. She came out into the yard, wiping her hands on a rag, and waited for him to say what he had come to say. Roy stood beside his truck. He looked older than he had looked even 6 months ago. The hospital had taken something from him, not his dignity, but some outer layer that had been keeping the age at a slight distance. He looked, Ruth thought, like the land looked after a hard winter. Honest, reduced to what it actually was. "I want to sell the farm," he said. "The rest of it, the 1,600 acres. Ruth waited. "I could sell to anyone," he said. "There are people who'd pay top dollar and split it up in 5 years. I don't want that," he paused. "The North Field's been contiguous since 1927. I don't want to see it split up." He looked at her. "You'd keep it whole," he said. "I know you would." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the barn. She looked at the Farmall, still visible in the shadows of the equipment shed, its restored red paint catching the afternoon light. "I'll pay market rate," she said. "Not a dollar less, not a dollar more." Roy nodded. "That's what I want." The paperwork took 3 weeks. Aldrich processed the sale with the careful efficiency of a man who has handled a great many transactions in his career and recognizes when a particular transaction is more than a transaction. The price was fair. The deed transferred cleanly. Roy and Loretta moved to a small house in Shenandoah where Loretta's sister lived, and Roy spent his days doing the things that men who can no longer farm do when they have the kind of relationship with land that Roy had, driving past fields, watching from the road, reading the conditions of other people's crops, with the involuntary expertise of a man who has been reading fields his entire life. On the day the papers signed, Ruth called Thomas Hargrove. She had met Thomas twice, once briefly at the fair in 1979 when he was 22 and working the family operation, and once at the hospital after Roy's heart attack. He was 37 now, with the particular quality of a man who has spent his adult life working in agriculture without having land of his own, to work competent, experience, slightly unmoored. He drove down from Omaha on a Saturday morning, and Ruth met him at the kitchen table with coffee and the deed to 400 acres of the original Hargrove land signed over to Thomas Hargrove free and clear. Thomas looked at the deed for a long time. Then he looked at Ruth. She held up her hand before he could speak. "Your grandfather paid my father a fair wage when my father had no leverage to ask for one," she said. "Your father made mistakes, but the land your grandfather built was solid land tended right for 50 years. You didn't make any mistakes at all." She set her coffee down. "Your family doesn't need to leave Fremont County. This is where your name belongs." Thomas Hargrove sat at Ruth Caldwell's kitchen table for a moment in the specific silence of a person who has received something they did not know they needed until it was given. He was not a man who cried easily, but his eyes were wet when he finally spoke, and what he said was simple, and Ruth received it the way Walt Caldwell would have received it, quietly, without performance, as something that had passed between two people and did not need to be made into more than it was. Ruth Caldwell farmed her land until she was 75 years old. In 2010, she transferred the operation to her nephew, a man named Garrett Caldwell, who had been working alongside her for 8 years and who understood the land the way Ruth's father had taught her to understand it, not as a possession, but as a responsibility. Something you receive and tend and pass forward in better condition than you found it. Ruth died in the spring of 2012 on a morning in April when the fields were just beginning to turn, when the soil had that particular dark richness it carries for the 10 days between the thaw and the first cultivation. She was 76 years old. She died in her own bed in the farmhouse her father had built, with the windows open and the smell of the fields coming in. Garrett found the savings account passbook in the kitchen drawer with a note in Ruth's handwriting that said simply for the farm. The balance had been rebuilt over the years. It was at Ruth's death considerably more than $10,000. But the first $10,000, the $10,000 that Roy Hargrove had written on a check at the Fremont County Fair on a hot August afternoon in 1979, Garrett was certain because Ruth had told him once that those particular dollars had been among the ones that paid for Thomas Hargrove's 400 acres. That the money had moved in the end, the way Walt Caldwell had believed money should move when it carried a lesson back toward the place where the lesson had originated. The Farmall 560 is still in the equipment barn. Garrett's son Ruth's great-nephew, a boy named Walt, named deliberately at Ruth's quiet suggestion when he was born in 2001, restored it in 2019. He was 18 years old that summer, and he spent 3 months stripping the tractor down to bare metal and building it back up with the kind of care that is only possible when you understand what you are working on. He ground the rust off. He replaced the seals. He had the engine rebuilt by a machinist in Council Bluffs, who, when he saw the internal components, put down his tools and looked at the engine block for a long moment and asked very carefully where this tractor had come from. Young Walt told him. The machinist shook his head and said that in 35 years of rebuilding agricultural engines, he had seen 2 other units with similar specifications. Both had come from the same source. Both had the same test designation stamped into the block, a sequence of letters and numbers that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at and meant a great deal to anyone who did. He rebuilt the engine with the precision it deserved. The tractor runs better now than it has in decades. Every August during the Fremont County Fair, Garrett and young Walt bring the Farmall to the fairgrounds and park it near the pull track. They set up a small folding table beside it with a photograph of Ruth and a laminated card that tells the story, the bet, the pull, the upset, the years that followed the morning in February, when Ruth sat down in a chair across from a man who had lost everything and made him an offer he didn't deserve, and that she made anyway. People stop and read the card. They look at the tractor. They look at the photograph of Ruth, a woman with a plain face and steady eyes and a work cap set level on her head, standing in a field in what appears to be late summer, the horizon behind her flat and open the way Iowa horizons are flat and open, going all the way to the edge of the world. They shake their heads. Hard to believe they say, that old thing beat a brand new John Deere. Young Walt, who has heard this every August since he was old enough to stand beside the tractor and answer questions, nods and says what his great-aunt told him to say if anyone ever asked. It's not about what's new, he says. It's about what's been tended. He says it the way Ruth said most important things plainly without ornament, in the specific tone of a person who learned it from someone who learned it from someone else, and who understands that the learning is inseparable from the tending, and the tending is the whole point, and the whole point is to pass it forward in better condition than you found it. The Farmall idles beside the pull track in the August heat, its restored engine running with the deep authoritative sound that surprised everyone who heard it for the first time in 1979, and that still, all these years later, sounds too large for the machine it is coming from, the way certain things always do.